Elijah Kane stood at the back of the dusty auction barn, eyes fixed on the German shepherd limping through the crowd. The dog's leg dragged hopelessly behind him, a silent testament to years of abuse. The whispers around him were sharp, mocking, and full of indifference. No one wanted him, except for one man. As the auctioneer's gavel rose, ready to call the dog's fate, Elijah's hand shot up, a quiet but firm gesture. The crowd went still. No words were spoken, just an unspoken bond between man and dog. In that moment the gavel fell. The dog's life was sealed by a single silent choice. Elijah Kane was a man shaped by shadows. Once a promising officer in the local police force, his career had unraveled after exposing the corrupt practices within his department, a move that cost him everything. Friends, family, and his career were all casualties in the war between right and wrong. He fled the city, settling into a secluded cabin outside of Laurel, Montana. Here, away from the eyes of those who knew him, Elijah tried to bury the past beneath the silence of the surrounding woods. But the guilt never fully left, gnawing at him like a persistent ache. His isolation was a self-imposed punishment for his inability to act when it mattered most. With his soul fractured and broken, Elijah tried to rebuild a semblance of a life, working odd jobs and keeping his distance from the world that once defined him. But deep down, he knew he was still running. Rook was not just any stray. He was a broken animal, whose wounds were more than just physical. The German shepherd limped into the auction ring, his hind leg dragging like a painful reminder of the cruelty he'd endured. His coat was matted with dirt and old blood, and his once proud eyes now held only the weight of suffering. To everyone else, he was worthless, just another discarded animal in a sea of livestock. But to Elijah, there was something in those amber eyes that spoke louder than any words. The dog's scars weren't just from the past. They were the echoes of betrayal and pain, as if he had been abandoned by everyone he trusted. For a moment, it wasn't just the dog who stood there, lost and broken. It was Elijah too, standing at the edge of his own personal wreckage. And in the silence of that auction barn, their paths crossed. The barn was alive with noise, livestock being herded, buyers shouting out bids, and the clang of metal gates. In the midst of the chaos, Rook was led into the ring, his limp slowing him with every step. The harsh whispers from the crowd were like knives in the air. "Not worth it," someone muttered. "Too broken," another voice added. The auctioneer, usually swift and booming, faltered as he tried to sell the dog. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for anyone willing to take on the burden. But there was no one. No one raised a hand. The dog was labeled as useless, unwanted. It felt as though the entire barn had agreed that he wasn't worth saving. As the auctioneer's hammer began to rise, signaling the end, Elijah felt something shift deep inside him. The dog's eyes met his, and in that brief moment, there was no question in Elijah's mind. He didn't see a burden. He saw a creature as broken as he was, someone who had been discarded, left behind. Without thinking, Elijah stood up and raised his hand. The crowd fell into a stunned silence. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed in his chest. Rook's fate had just changed, so had Elijah's. The murmurs from the crowd were deafening, filled with confusion and judgment. "Why him?" someone whispered. "Doesn't he know what he's getting into?" But Elijah didn't hear the questions, nor did he care. His gaze remained locked on Rook, whose amber eyes never left him. It was a look that struck Elijah deep, a mix of fear, confusion, and a faint flicker of trust. Something about the dog spoke to him, a raw, unspoken connection that only the broken could understand. As the auctioneer stepped forward, unsure of how to proceed, Elijah made his way to the front, ignoring the eyes that followed him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the enormity of his decision. This wasn't just about taking in a dog. It was a step toward redemption for himself. He had been running for so long, but standing there, with Rook in front of him, he realized that maybe it was time to stop. Elijah knelt down slowly, not to grab or pull the dog, but to meet him at eye level. The dog, though hesitant, took a small step forward, and Elijah placed his hand gently on his shoulder. It wasn't pity, it wasn't obligation, it was understanding. And in that moment, Elijah knew they weren't just rescuing each other. They were saving what little was left of themselves. Back at the cabin, Elijah didn't rush to give Rook a grand welcome. He didn't know how to comfort the dog, and truth be told, he didn't know how to comfort himself. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, yet it was all they had. Elijah sat in the dim light of the cabin, his mind racing. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled as he poured himself a drink. Rook lay quietly by the fireplace, eyes flicking between Elijah and the shadows. The air felt too still, as though both man and dog were holding their breath, unwilling to face the truth of their shared scars. Elijah hadn't planned on rescuing anyone. He hadn't planned on opening his heart again. The last time he'd let anyone in, he'd lost everything: his career, his family, his sense of who he was. The sting of betrayal, the corruption that had eaten away at the police force, was still fresh in his memories. He had done nothing when he should have. He had watched, too afraid to act, too broken to speak. And now, years later, he found himself haunted by the ghosts of those decisions. Rook was no different. Both of them were castaways in a world that had turned its back on them. But Elijah couldn't keep running. He had been avoiding the past for too long. Maybe, just maybe, taking care of Rook, this wounded, silent dog, was the start of something that could redeem him. Perhaps it was his way of making amends for all he'd failed to do. Rook's past wasn't something that could be easily mended with food and shelter. Elijah watched as the dog hesitated before approaching his food bowl, as if unsure of what would come next. His movements were cautious, every step calculated. Elijah had seen animals like this before, those who had been abused to the point where their instincts were distorted, their trust broken. Rook wasn't just physically damaged. He was emotionally scarred in ways Elijah couldn't even begin to understand. Each night, Rook would curl up near the fire, but his eyes would remain wide open, darting at every sudden noise or movement. There were times Elijah would see Rook's body tense, his tail tucked between his legs, as if bracing for something that hadn't happened yet. Elijah tried to get close, to offer comfort, but Rook pulled away. It was as if the dog had been taught that any kindness was fleeting, that any touch might bring pain. What Elijah didn't know, however, was that Rook's story was more connected to his own than he could ever imagine. The dog had once belonged to a man Elijah had worked with long ago, the Willocks family, a name that sent a chill down his spine. They were known for their ruthless handling of animals, their underground dealings, and the cruel way they used dogs like Rook. Rook had been trained in ways Elijah never wanted to know, a living tool in a corrupt world he had once been a part of. The dog's scars, both visible and hidden, were a reflection of the same system that had broken Elijah himself. As the days passed, Elijah kept his distance, understanding that trust wasn't something that could be forced. Rook's wounds were not just on the surface, they ran deeper, woven into the very fabric of his being. Elijah would sit across from him in silence, never making sudden movements. Sometimes he would talk softly, not with the intention of making the dog listen, but just to fill the silence in the room. "You're safe here," he would whisper, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Rook or to himself. Gradually, Rook began to respond. At first, it was small. A slight shift in posture, a slight inching forward when Elijah offered food. But there was still hesitation. Rook would look up at Elijah with those amber eyes, so filled with caution, then lower his head again, as though trying to block out the world that had once been so cruel. It wasn't the same kind of trust that a dog might have with a loving owner. It was more fragile, tentative, like a promise that could break at any moment. One evening, as the fire crackled and the room was filled with the soft scent of wood, Elijah placed his hand on the floor between them, just a few inches from where Rook lay. For the longest time, neither moved. Then, with the smallest of movements, Rook shifted his paw forward, just enough to brush against Elijah's hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, Elijah felt like they were no longer strangers. They had started the slow, painful journey toward healing, not through words, but through a simple gesture of trust. One evening, as Elijah gently cleaned Rook's injured leg, something strange caught his eye. Something that wasn't just another scar. Under the matted fur, there was a small rusted metal tag, barely visible beneath Rook's skin. The markings on it were barely legible, but something in Elijah's gut told him this wasn't an ordinary tag. He froze for a moment, heart pounding in his chest as his hands carefully brushed away the fur. It was a faint number, followed by the words, Willock's Ranch. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. Elijah had worked for the Willock's family years ago, long before everything fell apart. The ranch had been a well-known establishment in the area, one that Elijah had done business with on occasion. But beneath the surface, the Willock's family ran illegal activities under the guise of legitimate farming. Elijah had turned a blind eye to it, choosing silence over speaking out. His conscience had betrayed him then, and now it was catching up with him. As the weight of the discovery settled on him, Elijah stared down at the dog, Rook. The dog wasn't just another victim. He was tied to the very system Elijah had once been a part of. The truth was undeniable. Rook's suffering, his broken body, were a direct result of the very people Elijah had once worked for. He had never wanted to face the truth of his past, but now there was no escaping it. Rook wasn't just a stray he had rescued. He was a painful reminder of everything Elijah had failed to confront. The discovery of Rook's connection to the Willock's Ranch sent a chill through Elijah's veins, one that reverberated deep into the recesses of his soul. He couldn't ignore the weight of it. The past that he had so desperately tried to outrun was now staring him in the face, embodied in the form of this scarred, silent dog. He had always told himself that he was done with that part of his life, that he was no longer the man who turned a blind eye to the injustices happening right under his nose. But now that man was back, lurking in the shadows of his conscience, forcing him to confront his complicity. For the first time since his fall from grace, Elijah realized that he couldn't just sit idly by anymore. He had to act, not just for Rook, but for the countless others who had been silenced by the system he had once been part of. If he was going to heal, he had to start by righting the wrongs he had allowed to continue. And so, he made a decision. He would expose the truth about the Willock's family and the underground animal trade they had run. It wasn't just about Rook anymore. It was about redemption. It was about taking responsibility for his failures. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Elijah knew that by digging into the past, he was digging up his own buried demons. The Willock's family's power and influence stretched far beyond what most people understood, and speaking out meant risking everything once more. But Elijah's resolve was firm. He would gather the evidence, speak to the few brave souls who had witnessed the truth, and take the first steps in bringing down the empire that had tainted his own past. As he looked down at Rook, the dog's amber eyes locking with his, Elijah realized that this wasn't just about the past. It was about giving both of them a chance to move forward. Together, they would face the truth, no matter the cost. Elijah's journey into the darkness of the past wasn't one he could take lightly. Each document he uncovered, every person he spoke to, sent ripples of fear and guilt crashing through him. The more he pieced together the horrifying truth about the Willock's family, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. The ranch, which had once seemed like a benign place to work, was a hub for illegal dogfighting and underground trafficking, an operation built on violence and exploitation. Rook, with his broken body and scarred spirit, had been one of the many animals used, abused, and discarded by people who saw living beings as mere commodities. But what made Elijah's task even more perilous was the fact that the Willock's family still held considerable sway in the community. Their reach extended beyond the ranch, infiltrating local law enforcement and businesses. Elijah, despite his knowledge and experience, wasn't naive enough to think that the truth would be embraced with open arms. He knew it would come with resistance, even danger. Yet, as he dug deeper into the records and started to make discreet inquiries, he realized that the Willock's family wasn't just untouchable. They were actively erasing their traces, covering up their criminal activity with ruthless efficiency. One evening, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table, sifting through the old papers, he received an unexpected knock at the door. His heart skipped. He knew who it was before he even looked through the peephole. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer stood on the other side, his face unreadable, his posture tense. "I figured you'd be digging into this sooner or later," Dwyer said, his voice low. He didn't wait for Elijah to invite him in, stepping inside with an unsettling familiarity. "But I hope you know, Elijah, the truth won't set you free. It'll make you a target. Elijah stared at him, the weight of Dwyer's words sinking in. The path ahead was more dangerous than he had anticipated. The stakes were higher now, not just for him, but for Rook too. He couldn't back down, not after everything they had both been through. The time for silence was over. Elijah stood at the edge of the Willocks ranch, the cold wind cutting through his worn leather jacket. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from a deep, gnawing resolve. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for, the confrontation that could either free him from the chains of his past or drag him even deeper into the abyss. Rook stood beside him, the dog's once terrified gaze now fixed, determined. They both had come a long way. Elijah wasn't here for justice in the traditional sense. He wasn't foolish enough to think he could just march in and take down the empire that had long thrived on fear and manipulation. What he wanted, what he needed, was the truth to come to light, no matter how messy or dangerous it would be. He had to expose the rot that lay hidden beneath the ranch's seemingly pristine exterior. The truth had to be known. He stepped onto the ranch, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The main house loomed ahead, its weathered walls holding the secrets of decades. As Elijah approached the front door, his mind flashed back to the times he had been here as a young man, naive, eager to prove himself. He remembered the tension in the air, the unspoken rules that governed the Willocks family. The air had always felt thick with something dark, but he had ignored it then. Now, there was no ignoring it. The door opened with a creak. Everett Willocks, the patriarch of the family, stood in the doorway, a cold smile on his lips. "I wondered when you'd show up, Elijah," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "We both know you're not here for a social call." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm here to end this, Everett. It's over." And with those words, everything that had been hidden for years began to unravel. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Elijah's words hung between them, but Everett didn't seem fazed. His smile deepened, his eyes cold and calculating. "You always were the idealist, Elijah," he said with a chuckle, his tone mocking. "You think you can take us down with your half-baked crusade? You've been running from your own demons for years. Now you want to bring us down? You're too late." Elijah's jaw clenched, the weight of Everett's words cutting deeper than any blade. This man, the one who had caused so much harm, who had twisted the lives of so many, including Rook's, stood before him as if he were untouchable. Elijah felt the old anger rise up in his chest. He wasn't going to back down this time. He couldn't. He stepped forward, ignoring the sneer on Everett's face. "I've seen too much. I was complicit once, but not anymore," Elijah said through gritted teeth. "Your empire is crumbling, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Everett's eyes darkened, his hand subtly moving to his side, where a gun was tucked under his jacket. "You've always been a fool, Elijah? You think exposing us will change anything? You can't escape your past, and you can't stop what's already been set in motion." At that moment, everything went silent. Rook, standing at Elijah's side, let out a low growl, a warning, as if sensing the danger that was about to unfold. The truth wasn't just going to be handed to Elijah, it would come with a price. As the standoff stretched on, the realization settled over Elijah. He had no choice but to go all in. This wasn't just about exposing the Willocks family anymore. This was a fight for his very soul. The air crackled with the weight of unspoken threats. Elijah stood firm, his eyes never leaving Everett's. The presence of the gun at Everett's side was a clear warning, but Elijah felt a strange calm wash over him. There was no turning back now. He had spent years running from his past, but now, standing in front of the man who had caused so much suffering, there was nothing left to fear. "I didn't come here to fight," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady. "I came here to stop you, to make sure no more lives are destroyed by people like you." Everett's eyes narrowed, but the tension in the room remained thick. He knew he couldn't scare Elijah into silence anymore. The truth was too powerful. "You'll regret this," Everett warned, his voice laced with venom. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." But Elijah was already walking away, toward the door. His decision was made. The truth would be exposed, and whatever happened next, he would face it head-on. As Elijah stepped out into the cold night, he knew there would be consequences, but something within him had shifted. Rook, The dog, who had once been so broken, now stood beside him as a symbol of everything he was fighting for. The past was no longer a shadow chasing him. It was the driving force that propelled him forward. The road ahead was uncertain, and Elijah knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in years, there was a spark of hope flickering in his chest. He was no longer a man trapped by his own failures. He wasn't running anymore. The truth had been set into motion, and no matter how difficult the journey would be, Elijah had made a choice. He would not turn back. Rook walked beside him, his limp less pronounced with every step, as if the dog, too, was shedding the weight of the past. The bond between them had grown stronger over the past few weeks, forged not just in the quiet moments of shared silence, but in their shared understanding of pain, guilt, and the need for redemption. As they made their way to the truck, Elijah could feel the weight of what he had to do next. Going public, rallying support, facing whatever retaliation the Willox family would surely unleash. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had already lost everything once. But now he had something worth fighting for: the truth and the chance to make it right. The truck's engine roared to life as Elijah drove away from the ranch. Rook lay on the seat beside him, his eyes calm, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The road stretched out before them, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Elijah was ready to walk it. Elijah spent the following weeks gathering every shred of evidence he could find, his heart heavy but determined. He reached out to former workers of the Willox Ranch, those who had once been too scared to speak up. Piece by piece, the truth came together. The story began to spread, slowly like a ripple in a vast lake, but the ripple grew. As more and more people came forward, the Willox family's empire started to crumble. Elijah and Rook, once broken and discarded, now had a purpose. Together, they had not only fought for justice, but they had reclaimed their own lives. The past had been a dark, suffocating place for Elijah, but he had learned something valuable through his journey. Healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about making peace with it. The truth had set them free, but it was the quiet moments of connection with Rook that truly restored his sense of self. As they sat together by the fire in their new home, Elijah realized that sometimes redemption didn't come in grand gestures or dramatic victories. It came in the smallest of moments, the ones that whispered of healing, of starting over. And finally, he was ready to live again.